The rise and fall of Jimmy Swaggart. His sermons reached into tens of millions of American living rooms every single week. He built one of the largest television ministries the world had ever seen, sold more than 20 million gospel records, and stood, by the mid-1980s, as one of the most powerful religious broadcasters on the planet. Then, in a matter of weeks, all of it nearly collapsed. How did one of America's most famous televangelists go from filling stadiums and dominating national television to becoming the center of one of the biggest religious scandals of the 20th century? And how, against every expectation, did he manage to keep preaching for nearly 4 more decades afterward? This is the story of Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Lee Swaggart was born on March 15, 1935, in Ferriday, Louisiana, a small town on the banks of the Mississippi River. He was the son of a working-class family shaped by hard times and deep Pentecostal faith, and by his own later account, he began preaching on street corners at the age of 9, standing on makeshift platforms to share what he believed was already a clear and unmistakable calling. Ferriday, despite its small size, would go on to produce an extraordinary cluster of American musical talent, and Swaggart's own family sat at the center of it. His first cousins were Jerry Lee Lewis, who would become one of the founding architects of rock and roll, and Mickey Gilley, who would go on to become one of the defining voices of country music. The 3 boys, born within roughly a year of each other, grew up together, learned piano together, and were shaped by the same blend of Pentecostal church music and raw, untrained musical instinct that would eventually carry each of them in strikingly different directions to national fame. That shared musical inheritance would prove essential to Swaggart's own path. Unlike his cousins, Swaggart chose to direct his talent entirely toward the pulpit rather than the stage. But the piano-driven, emotionally charged style he brought to gospel music would become one of the defining features of his ministry for the rest of his life. As a young man, Swaggart struggled with the tension between his musical gifts and his religious upbringing, torn, as he described it, between what he saw as the sinful world represented by secular music and the calling he felt toward ministry. He married Frances Anderson in 1952, when both were still teenagers, and Frances would remain at his side, publicly and prominently, for the rest of his life and career, standing beside him through every triumph and every controversy that followed. By his early 20s, Swaggart had committed fully to ministry, becoming a full-time evangelist in 1958 and receiving ordination from the Assemblies of God in 1961, the Pentecostal denomination that would define his religious identity and eventually become the center of the most consequential conflict of his career. In those early years, few who watched him could have imagined just how large his ministry would eventually become, or how completely its fortunes would one day become tied to the personal conduct of the man leading it. Swaggart began his ministry the way countless Pentecostal evangelists of his generation did, traveling from town to town across the American South, preaching under canvas tents to whoever would gather to hear him. These tent revivals were physically demanding, financially precarious, and utterly dependent on Swaggart's ability to hold a crowd's attention purely through the force of his voice and conviction. He proved extraordinarily good at it. Congregants and fellow ministers alike described a preaching style that combined old-fashioned Pentecostal fire with unmistakable musical sensibility. Sermons that built like songs, rising and falling with the same emotional rhythm that had made his cousin Jerry Lee Lewis a sensation on entirely different stages. By the early 1960s, Swaggart had begun expanding beyond the tent circuit into radio, a medium that allowed his voice to reach far beyond whatever town he happened to be preaching in on a given night. Radio broadcasts of his sermons steadily built a regional audience across Louisiana and the surrounding states, and by the end of the decade, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries had become a recognized name throughout the American South. Television, however, is what transformed Swaggart from a well-known regional preacher into a genuine national phenomenon. He began broadcasting televised services in the early 1970s, at a moment when television ministry was still a relatively new frontier for American Christianity, and few broadcasters understood its emotional power as intuitively as Swaggart did. His weekly telecast, built around his preaching, his gospel piano playing, and his unmistakably raw, tearful delivery, spread rapidly across American cable and broadcast television through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. By the middle of the decade, Swaggart's program was reaching an estimated 2 million households across the United States on a weekly basis, and was being broadcast internationally in dozens of countries and translated into multiple languages. The ministry's headquarters in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, grew alongside the broadcast audience, eventually encompassing a large sanctuary, television production facilities, and Jimmy Swaggart Bible College, which trained new generations of Pentecostal ministers directly under Swaggart's influence and doctrine. Music remained central to his identity throughout this rise. Over the course of his career, Swaggart recorded more than 200 gospel albums, selling more than 20 million records worldwide. Commercial success that placed him not only among the most popular religious broadcasters in America, but among its best-selling gospel recording artists as well. By 1986, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries was generating an estimated $142 million annually in contributions, a staggering figure that placed Swaggart among the wealthiest and most influential televangelists in the country, in an era already dominated by a handful of enormous television ministries, competing for the same national audience. To the millions who tuned in every week, Swaggart represented something distinct even among his fellow televangelists, a preacher who seemed, by his own repeated public claims, to hold himself to an unusually strict moral standard. Someone who spoke forcefully against the very kind of scandal that had already begun to touch other prominent ministries during the decade. That reputation for strictness and Swaggart's own willingness to publicly criticize other televangelists for moral failings would soon become one of the most consequential and, in hindsight, most ironic aspects of his entire career. By the mid-1980s, Swaggart's television ministry had grown into one of the largest and most recognizable in the country, broadcasting audiences not only across the United States, but around the world. With his sermons translated for viewers in Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, his international crusades drew enormous crowds. In March of 1987, he preached to nearly 14,000 people at a single crusade in Los Angeles, one of dozens of large-scale gatherings he led across the country and abroad during this period, each one broadcast and rebroadcast to his growing television audience. His gospel recordings continued to sell in extraordinary numbers throughout the decade, and his books, blending doctrine, testimony, and cultural commentary, found a wide readership among Pentecostal and evangelical Christians well beyond his immediate broadcast audience. Within Pentecostal Christianity specifically, Swaggart's influence was difficult to overstate. His preaching style, his approach to worship music, and particular blend of old-fashioned revivalism with modern broadcast technology shaped an entire generation of ministers who grew up watching his telecasts, many of whom would go on to build their own ministries modeled, in part, on his example. But the 1980s were also a period of intensifying public scrutiny for American televangelism as a whole. As television ministries grew larger, wealthier, and more influential, journalists and the wider public began asking harder questions about financial transparency, personal conduct, and enormous, largely unchecked power these ministries had accumulated over their independent religious empires. Swaggart himself contributed directly to this atmosphere of scrutiny. Throughout the mid-1980s, he had become known for publicly criticizing rival televangelists whom he considered morally or doctrinally compromised, including a pointed and very public 1987 accusation that fellow televangelist Jim Bakker had engaged in serious sexual misconduct, an accusation that many observers at the time believed was motivated, at least in part, by competition for the same national television audience and donor base. That accusation would not remain without consequence. It set in motion a chain of events that Swaggart himself could not have fully anticipated, and that would, within a single year, bring his own private conduct into public view in the most dramatic way imaginable. The path toward Swaggart's public downfall began not with Bakker, but with another rival minister entirely, a New Orleans evangelist named Marvin Gorman, whom Swaggart had previously and publicly accused of extramarital affairs, allegations that had contributed directly to Gorman's own defrocking by the Assemblies of God years earlier. Bitter over the loss of his ministry and convinced that Swaggart's own private conduct did not match his public moral crusading, Gorman began investigating rumors that Swaggart had a long-running habit of soliciting sex workers at motels outside New Orleans. According to later reporting, Gorman's son, a police officer, along with hired private investigators, began surveilling one such motel in early 1987, eventually photographing Swaggart entering and exiting a room on multiple occasions. The woman involved was a local sex worker named Deborah Murphy, who would later confirm to reporters that Swaggart had been a regular client for roughly a year, paid between $30 and $40 per visit. In subsequent interviews, Murphy stated that the two had not engaged in sexual intercourse. Rather, according to her account, Swaggart had repeatedly paid her to pose for him. According to later reporting, Gorman initially attempted to use the photographs privately, confronting Swaggart directly and proposing that Swaggart help clear the way for his own reinstatement within the Assemblies of God in exchange for Gorman's silence. When that arrangement broke down in early 1988, Gorman took the evidence directly to the church's national leadership. On February 15, 1988, Gorman formally presented the photographic evidence to the Assemblies of God's Executive Presbytery, the denomination's highest governing body. Within days, church leaders confronted Swaggart directly with the evidence, and Swaggart, according to multiple contemporaneous accounts, initially responded not with contrition, but with defiance, reportedly telling denominational leaders that he answered to God rather than to any church board. That response, according to later reporting, only hardened the church leadership's position, and the disciplinary consequences under discussion grew more serious as a result. On February 21st, 1988, in one of the most widely remembered moments in American televangelism history, Jimmy Swaggart stood before his congregation and a national television audience and delivered what became known simply as his "I Have Sinned" sermon. With tears streaming down his face and Francis Swaggart standing visibly beside him, he offered a raw, emotional apology, telling his congregation, "I have sinned against you, and I beg your forgiveness." Notably, Swaggart never specified in that broadcast precisely what he'd done, offering only the vague acknowledgement of sin and moral failure, without any direct reference to prostitution or to Deborah Murphy by name. To the millions watching, the confession was devastating in its emotional rawness, even as it remained deliberately unspecific about the underlying conduct. Behind the scenes, Swaggart reportedly told Assemblies of God leadership that he suffered from what he described as a lifelong addiction to pornography, an admission that, according to those close to the process, was intended to explain his conduct within a framework of compulsion and spiritual struggle, rather than deliberate, ongoing misconduct. In the aftermath of the confession, the Assemblies of God's leadership moved to discipline Swaggart formally. The denomination recommended a lengthy rehabilitation process, including a full year during which Swaggart would not preach at all, followed by an additional period of probation and oversight, discipline that mirrored, in both scope and intent, the same standards the denomination applied to other ministers found guilty of serious moral failure. Swaggart, by multiple contemporaneous accounts, responded to this proposed discipline with open defiance. According to reporting from the time, he told denominational leaders directly that he did not accept their authority to impose the discipline they proposed, at one point reportedly insisting that his own ministry could not survive a year away from the pulpit and television screen. That refusal escalated the conflict considerably. The Assemblies of God's national leadership, offended by what several officials described as Swaggart's arrogance in rejecting the proposed discipline, moved to increase his suspension from 1 year to 2, and began formal proceedings to revoke his ministerial credentials entirely. Facing formal defrocking, Swaggart chose to resign from the Assemblies of God before the denomination could complete the process. In April 1988, the church announced it had expelled him for refusing to accept its disciplinary terms, and Swaggart, in turn, announced he would return to preaching independently, without any denominational oversight at all, vowed to save what he described as his $150 million a year ministry. The split marked a profound turning point, not just for Swaggart personally, but for the broader landscape of American televangelism. Unlike ministers who remain tethered to denominational structures and their accompanying accountability, Swaggart would spend the remainder of his career operating entirely independently, answerable, in practice, only to his own ministry's board and to his television audience. Media coverage of the entire episode was intense and unrelenting, placing Swaggart's downfall alongside those of Jim Bakker and other prominent televangelists of the era in a wave of scandal coverage that reshaped public perception of televised American Christianity for years afterward. Despite the scale of the scandal, Swaggart's ministry did not collapse. Within a matter of weeks, he had returned to the pulpit, and though his television audience contracted significantly from its mid-1980s peak, it did not disappear. Over the following several years, his weekly viewership rebuilt to an estimated 800,000 households, a fraction of his previous audience, but still a substantial national platform by any measure. For a time, it appeared that Swaggart, like several of his contemporaries, had weathered the worst of what public scandal could bring to a television ministry. That assumption would not last. 3 years later, in October of 1991, Swaggart's ministry faced a second, strikingly similar crisis. On October 11th, while driving in Indio, California, Swaggart was pulled over by a California Highway Patrol officer for driving on the wrong side of the road, in a vehicle that was also found to be unregistered. In the passenger seat was a 31-year-old woman named Rosemary Garcia. When questioned by the officer about her relationship to Swaggart, Garcia stated plainly that she did not know him personally and that he had picked her up off the street. Asked directly what Swaggart had wanted from her, Garcia later told a Los Angeles television station without hesitation that he had solicited her for sex, adding simply that solicitation was, in her words, what she did for a living. The story broke rapidly across national media, drawing immediate comparisons to the 1988 scandal and reigniting intense public scrutiny of Swaggart's private conduct. This time, however, Swaggart's public response differed sharply from his tearful 1988 confession. Rather than offering another emotional apology, Swaggart addressed his congregation with open defiance, telling them plainly that, in his words, the matter was, quote, flat none of their business. He offered no detailed acknowledgement of what had occurred, framing the entire episode as a private matter between himself and God rather than one requiring any accounting to his congregation or the wider public. His son, Donnie Swaggart, then a rising figure within the ministry's leadership, announced to the stunned congregation that his father would step down temporarily, describing the period as one of healing and counseling. In practice, that stepping down proved brief. Swaggart returned to the pulpit within days. Public reaction to this second episode was markedly harsher than it had been in 1988, where his first scandal had, for many, been softened by the raw emotion of his televised confession. The second incident, met with what many viewed as defiance rather than contrition, did lasting damage to his public reputation, even among many who had been willing to forgive the events of 3 years earlier. The financial consequences were significant and immediate. In early 1992, Francis Swaggart sent a fundraising letter to supporters acknowledging a deficit of $1.5 million in the ministry's finances, asking for continued support despite the controversy, and expressing confidence that, in her words, the ministry's best days remained ahead. The ministry's physical footprint told a similar story over the following years. By the late 1990s, journalists visiting the Baton Rouge campus described a facility whose enormous parking lot, once filled to capacity for services and broadcasts, now sat largely empty on any given Sunday. Before we look at how Swaggart's ministry evolved in the decades that followed, we want to pause and say a genuine thank you for spending this time with us. If documentaries like this one, that take the time to research thoroughly and present difficult stories fairly, are something you value, we'd really appreciate it if you consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue doing this kind of careful, in-depth storytelling. Despite the damage of both scandals, Jimmy Swaggart never fully stepped away from ministry, and the decades that followed revealed just how durable his core audience and his own sense of divine calling truly remained. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Swaggart continued broadcasting from his Baton Rouge headquarters, rebuilding his ministry gradually around a smaller, more devoted core audience rather than the mass national reach he had once commanded. In 1995, he launched the Sun Life Radio Network, extending his ministry into a new broadcast format, and later established the Sun Life Broadcasting Network, which would carry his television and radio programming for the remainder of his life. Increasingly, the ministry became a family operation. His son, Donnie Swaggart, took on a growing leadership role over the following decades, eventually becoming pastor of the ministry's Family Worship Center congregation and a central figure in the network's ongoing broadcasts, ensuring the ministry's continuity even as Jimmy Swaggart himself aged. Jimmy Swaggart Bible College continued operating throughout this period, training new generations of Pentecostal ministers under the doctrinal framework Swaggart had built over decades, and ensuring that his theological influence extended well beyond his own lifetime through students who would go on to lead congregations of their own. Swaggart's public statements over these years remained, at times, a source of controversy independent of the earlier scandals. He drew criticism on multiple occasions for remarks about other faiths and about LGBTQ people, including a widely reported 2004 comment in which he stated he would respond violently if a gay man expressed romantic interest in him, a remark for which he later issued a public apology. Despite these ongoing controversies, Swaggart's core audience remained loyal, and his ministry continued operating as a significant, if reduced, presence within American Pentecostal broadcasting for the remainder of his life. Supporters continue to point to his musical legacy, his decades of continuous preaching, and his family's ongoing ministry as evidence of genuine, lasting faith. Critics continue to point to the two scandals and to his repeated refusal to submit to any outside denominational accountability as evidence of a deeper pattern that had never been fully addressed. Jimmy Swaggart continued preaching from the same Baton Rouge pulpit into his final years, appearing alongside Donnie in the ministry's ongoing broadcasts, even as his physical health began to decline. In 2022, he delivered remarks at the funeral of his cousin, rock and roll pioneer Jerry Lee Lewis, a final, public link to the Ferriday, Louisiana upbringing the two men had shared nearly 9 decades earlier. In the summer of 2025, following a cardiac arrest, Jimmy Swaggart died at the age of 90, closing a religious broadcasting career that had spanned more than 60 years, survived 2 major public scandals, and left behind a ministry still actively led by his son. His death drew renewed public reflection on a career defined, from nearly every angle, by extremes: extraordinary popular success, extraordinary public scandal, and an extraordinary decades-long ability to rebuild an audience that, by any conventional measure, might have been expected to abandon him entirely after 1988, let alone after 1991. Jimmy Swaggart's story sits at the center of a larger and still unresolved conversation about American televangelism itself, about the enormous, largely unchecked power that independent television ministries accumulated during the second half of the 20th century, and about how little formal accountability often existed to check that power once a minister's personal charisma and broadcast reach grew large enough. His career illustrates, perhaps more starkly than that of any of his contemporaries, how thoroughly personal charisma and a devoted broadcast audience could, in practice, override formal denominational discipline. When the Assemblies of God attempted to impose meaningful consequences in 1988, Swaggart simply left the denomination rather than submit to them, a choice that effectively removed any remaining institutional check on his conduct for the rest of his career. That pattern repeated itself in 1991, when Swaggart, operating entirely outside denominational oversight, was able to characterize a second, strikingly similar episode as a private matter beyond anyone's legitimate concern, and to return his pulpit within days, with no external body positioned to impose any consequence at all. For scholars of American religious broadcasting, Swaggart's career has become something of a case study in the structural vulnerabilities of independent television ministry, vulnerabilities that would recur in various forms across other prominent ministries in the decades that followed his own scandals. For many of the millions who once watched his broadcasts, Swaggart's legacy remains genuinely difficult to categorize. He was by any measure an extraordinarily gifted communicator and musician, whose gospel recordings and broadcasts brought comfort and, by his supporters' own accounts, genuine spiritual meaning to a significant global audience across 6 decades. He was also, according to his own public admissions and extensive contemporaneous reporting, a man whose private conduct repeatedly and directly contradicted the moral standards he preached, and who resisted nearly every formal attempt to hold him accountable for that contradiction. Neither of those things cancels the other out. Both remain part of the same complicated public record. What Jimmy Swaggart's story ultimately offers is not a simple lesson about hypocrisy, nor a simple story of redemption. It is a more difficult and more honest reflection of how public trust, once granted an enormous scale, can survive scandal after scandal, so long as an audience remains willing to separate the message from the messenger, and so long as no outside structure exists with the authority or the will to insist otherwise. Jimmy Swaggart spent his life telling audiences that grace was available to anyone, no matter how far they had fallen. His own career became, in its own unplanned way, one of the most extensively documented public tests of exactly that claim. If this documentary gave you something to think about fame, forgiveness, accountability, and the particular power of television to shape and reshape a person's public image, we genuinely welcome your thoughts in the comments below. Please keep the discussion respectful. This is a complicated story involving real people and real consequences. If you found this valuable, consider subscribing, sharing it with someone who might find it interesting, and watching another of our documentaries linked at the end of this video. Thank you for watching.